In this lesson, we are going to discuss Roman-style villas from the 1st century CE. A villa was a large house owned by a wealthy citizen. We will explore the layout and functions of the rooms, including their decorations and adornments, and wrap up by considering how class differences in the ancient Mediterranean world may have had a great impact on other cultures. From this blueprint view of a Roman villa, what elements of the house strike you as most important? How does the layout draw a visitor in and around the house? Within what kind of climate does this house exist? These are important questions to consider as you inspect this drawing. Here we have a view down a Pompeian street. Imagine, if you can, that the walls are not ruins, that the street is smooth with stones, and that there are people walking on the sidewalk. Does it make you think of any modern cities? Remarkably, the ebb and flow of Pompeii almost 2,000 years ago would probably have been quite similar to a bustling urban area today. On the left, we see some doorways into shops and a villa. If space is at a premium, what elements fall by the wayside and what remain? How is this scene different from a house in a suburb or the country? As we step into the entryway called the Fauces, which means throat in Latin, we are greeted with a mosaic of a wild boar. The walls have frescoes, which are pictures painted directly onto the wet plaster. In the distance is what looks like a pit, which we will discuss shortly. As a visitor, how does this entryway make you feel? Perhaps you are a client coming to ask a favor from your patron. Do you enter haughtily or humbly as you see the rich opulence and foreboding menace of the savage animal? Are your eyes drawn up, down, or in any other direction as you take in the visual stimuli? By now, we have entered into the atrium. What seemed a pit in the previous slide is actually a sort of shallow pool called an impluvium. If you recall from the first slide, this is one of the largest areas in the whole house. You can see how spacious and open it is. To the sides are smaller rooms, such as cubicula or bedrooms. What was the function of this room? Was it meant for quiet reflection or to entertain guests? This is another house in its atrium. Here we can see the ceiling as well. There is a large opening directly above the impluvium called the compluvium. This was how the impluvium come to be filled with water. What else does the opening in the ceiling do? As you can see, it lets in light and perhaps it helps to regulate the temperature in the house as well. Notice too that the frescoes continue into the atrium. After so many years, they are still so red. How much more vibrant they must have been before. In many atria, a section of the wall would have a little niche in which the inhabitants could offer prayers and sacrifices to their household gods, called the lares. Once again, we are drawn to the very visual, almost cluttered imagery of the frescoes. The stylized fire above the podium seems to indicate that small fires might be lit there. Perhaps the picture of the pig's head shows one type of offering that would be pleasing to the gods. I can't tell you what each image represents, but let your imagination run wild. That's part of thinking like an archaeologist. We've entered the kitchen, called a culina. On top of this wood-burning stove are some metal pots and trivets. It is hard not to be astonished at just how similar their culture was to our own in many ways. However, what do we not see? The modern conveniences of electricity do not allow for appliances. And now on to the dining room, called a triclinium. Did you hear that? Triclinium. There were 3 bed-like couches placed in a U-shape where the diners could recline to eat. The frescoes have continued into this room as well. What kind of atmosphere does the layout of these couches create? If you were laying on your side, propped up on one arm, how would you eat and drink? How easily could you converse with your friends or family? This is one element of Roman life that is strikingly different from most modern American households. Think about what these differences show as a comparison between our cultures. Lastly, we come to the garden, called a hortus, like horticulture. This was the other large space in a typical villa. Would this space be used like the atrium to host guests, or as a quiet retreat to get away from the hustle and bustle of the streets outside? Do modern city houses or apartments have large green spaces? Are these spaces enclosed within walls? Who are we trying to keep out, or what are we trying to keep in? Let's briefly consider this apartment building called an insula. How is this structure different than the villa we've just walked through? You may notice there are more doors, more floors, less light, and smaller spaces. Who might live in these buildings? Let us also consider expansion. The Roman Empire expanded to its greatest height around this time, reaching as far north as the British Isles. When they got there, they found many people living in wattle and daub houses like the one pictured in the top left corner. How does this structure differ from the villa we've seen? How are changes in climate and lifestyle reflected in this? Note, though, that after the Romans had been around for a little while, some British peoples made houses like the one in the top right corner. What influences did wealthy Romans have on a vastly different culture like the British tribes? Consider also the styles of artwork. In the frescoes and mosaics of the villa, we saw subjects, animals, people, things depicted. In this mosaic in Britain, however, the subjects have been replaced with patterns, which are consistent with much artwork from the area before the Romans arrived. So, when we consider how architecture and art can move from one place to another, we must realize that the movement is not necessarily of a conqueror and a conquered, but that elements of both cultures persist and mix in new ways. In future lessons, we will see other ways that the Romans and the people they interacted with clashed, blended, and merged.